done our recording at last. That took some
Good.
doing. Unfortunately, now I can see how badly in need I am of a haircut. But anyway, we'll worry about that
No.
later. Okay, well, I'm joined today by Pat Rodgers in what will hopefully be the first of a series of discussions hosted by the ACS to promote its flagship journal, the Cricket Statistician. Pat had an essay, I should say, in issue 203, published in August. I have one in issue 204, out next month, and both are about wicketkeepers. So Pat and I thought it would be an excellent idea for us to shoot the shit and exchange notes. I'm usually in the interviewer's chair. I'm rather excited about having questions put to me. So maybe, Pat, you'd like to get us underway.
Thanks for having me, Rodney, and hello to all those who are watching this. I hope there are many of you. And to promote the journal, which I was very glad to be a part of for the first time in August, as Rodney said, and looking forward to the next one coming out, which contains, Rodney, your article on Ted Pooley, right? And Ted Pooley is someone you've seemed to become quite obsessed about. Right? You've written this article, but that's only after the autobiography, right, of Ted
I should
Pooley
say,
here.
in fairness, there's a bit of a duplication of efforts there. I thought, given how little reaction my introduction had gotten any reviews of that book, I ought perhaps to adapt it again into a devoted essay. I think I've made a few interesting findings there that have rather been brushed over.
And so how did you come about this interest in Ted Pooley? I know you've had an interest in the very first Test match ever, which he unfortunately wasn't to be a part of. Did it spring from there?
It very much did. I have a bit of trouble killing my darlings. One way of using all the stuff I discovered about Ted Pooley in the course of researching Test match number 1 might be to do something devoted to Pooley, so that I'm not finding all sorts of excuses and segues wherewith to shovel in all my Pooley material, especially given that he didn't actually play in the inaugural Test match. Famously, he was across the Tasman, sitting, as people say, in a Christchurch jail cell. So, adapting all the interviews, many of which I discovered for the first time, into a cohesive narrative, and then writing up that introduction in which I should say right now, I make the case, I think for the first time, that Pooley was the man who first dispensed with the long stop. This is an accolade that's often been given to the likes of Jack Blackham and George Pinder, but I think I establish beyond reasonable doubt that Pooley was the first man to do it by more than a decade.
Yes, and he's a real innovator, isn't he, as a wicket keeper? Have you ever kept wicket yourself?
I did last year, actually, and went triless. Yeah, I'd actually hurt a finger and couldn't bowl my leg breaks, and I like to be involved, so I thought, why not have a go at wicket keeping? It didn't do much good for the finger, but I didn't let any buys go, and only muffed one catch. I can't say I intend to make a career of it, though.
No, because you make the argument very well that in the article that wicket keepers are often overlooked, that cricket writing is often about batsmen particularly, and then great fast bowlers or leg spinners like yourself. But wicket keepers like Pooley, as I think you said, lie in cold oblivion often, and particularly for him.
Well, wicketkeepers as individuals certainly are a neglected topic. Jack Blackham, probably, almost certainly, in fact, a greater wicketkeeper than Pooley, still awaits his biography.
Yes.
If someone else doesn't do it, I might have to. Best we get our act together before we have that inflicted on the world. But even more than the individuals, it's the craft of wicket-keeping. It's evolution that's been neglected. There's a preconception that wicket-keeping evolved as follows. In the old days, wicket-keepers were basically rubbish and needed a long stop behind them as fortification or as an insurance policy. And so the narrative goes, as the craft of wicket-keeping improved, so players began to dispense with that insurance policy. Nothing could be further from the truth, in fact. What you have to understand about wicketkeeping in the age of the long stop is why they thought the long stop was necessary. They thought the long stop was necessary because they thought it necessary for wicketkeepers always to stand up to the stumps, regardless of how fast the bowling was. Now, I'd submit that most modern wicketkeepers, if they were forced to stand up to the likes of, I don't know, Mitchell Starc or Mark Wood, would probably quite like to have a long stop behind them too. In fact, it was a perfectly acceptable thing for them to do when a delivery got big on them, when a bouncer was bowled, for example, to do almost exactly as the batsman did, to evade it and leave it for the man behind them. The man who innovated his way towards the status quo we have now, standing back without a long stop, was Dick Lilly. He didn't do so because he was more skillful. It was an entirely sort of practical concession. Well, let's have an extra man in the field. I won't be quite as effective with respect to stumpings or whatever, but I'll be putting myself in a great deal less danger. So the idea that the ancients were rubbish and that's why they needed long stops doesn't have very much going for it. Your subject, I don't think we've mentioned him yet, Hammy Love. He kept in the post-Lilly era, didn't he?
Yes, he's in between the wars. So, yeah, Hampton Stanley Bray Love, very different character from Pooley. My interest has been in lately professional working class bowlers of the pre-Golden Age. So this was a bit of a departure for me to look at Love. And I've just always liked his name, Hammy Love. It's an unusual one.
I should say I once included him in a pair of fantasy 11s I made up called Vice v Virtue. Hammy Love always sounded like a vaguely dirty name to me. So
yes.
You can guess which team he got.
He was anything but dirty. He was a dapper young man and a very good, clean wicketkeeper. Very much like Pooley, enjoyed standing up to the stumps, right, to spinners, and he was in the era of a lot of spinners like O'Reilly and Grimmett, and he played with O'Reilly quite a bit, and O'Reilly was full of praise for the very clean and fine keeping of Hammy Love. But my article is called In Partnership with Love, and while Hammy Love's known for his keeping, I really wasn't that aware that he was such a fine batsman too. Unlike Pooley, he gets to play one test, right, as a keeper when he's 36, right towards the end of his career. It's a very sort of unusual career. And I suppose I came across him because I was looking for something that happened 100 years ago, just as a bit of a starter for an article. And 100 years ago, Bill Ponsford broke Archie McLaren's record, the highest first-class score, when he made 429 in Victoria's sort of unbelievable 1,059 against Tasmania. And in that innings of 429, he put on 336 with Hammy Love, who was in his first game for Victoria. And Hammy Love scored 156. And yes, I looked at his keeping, but also at his batting and his fine partnerships, which he had a lot of, particularly in Victoria.
Usually record-breaking partnerships, in fact.
Yes.
For a while, going through the list of batting partnerships, Hammy Love's name would have recurred a good deal. Perhaps you'd like to break down a few of his most significant alliances.
Yeah, well, that one was 336, as I said, in his first game with Ponsford. He'd played for New South Wales briefly before that. Just to put him into context a bit, he's playing before World War One, right? He's straight out of a private school in Sydney, and he plays for Balmain, the local team here. I'd helped do an updated history of the Balmain Cricket Club, which is in the heart of Sydney, and he was there playing straight out of school. Then he goes to war. He has a fairly easy war, if you can have such. He's a driver, right, in England. He doesn't go to the Western Front or anything. And he ends up in the 1919 AIF team, right, at the end of the war, but he only plays one game, and family business calls him back. So he's there playing for New South Wales soon after the war, and yes, he's in partnerships with Herbie Collins when he goes down to Victoria. He's in one with Harold Cranny, a record for the fifth wicket, 188 against South Australia. And he just seems to be someone who people must have enjoyed batting with, because he's in these long partnerships regularly throughout that early part of his career, when his way as a keeper is blocked by Bert Oldfield to start with, who comes into the AIF team and then comes back to block his way in New South Wales. And then a fellow called Jack Ellis, who's long-standing member of the Victorian team when Hammy tries his luck down in Melbourne. So he has to keep when he's able to, when they're injured or unavailable, but he really obviously works on his batting, and that's where he forms these fine partnerships.
Do you have a theory as to why he was such a prolific feature in these partnerships?
I think he seems to be, as I said, someone that these people enjoyed batting with, right? That he's a good runner between the wickets, that he's obviously got a lot of patience. He's a highly respected player right throughout the 20s. And yes, he just seems to be someone who's a good teammate, who is willing to dig in with them, sometimes get them out of trouble, and really rescue situations for his team. And yes, he certainly seems to be someone they enjoyed batting with, definitely.
Would you tell us a bit about his international career? Like you say, he had the door largely shut on him by the likes of Oldfield, but
Yes.
when he did get a shot, how did he go?
He's around till playing for Victoria in the early to mid-20s. Then he comes back to New South Wales, and still Oldfield's there. And it looks as though any chance of him playing for Australia is gone. He's struggling to make a very strong New South Wales team, mainly as a batsman. But in 1932-33, the stars align, because Jardine's team is out here on the famous Bodyline Tour, as we all know, and the door opens for him because Oldfield's taken sick with influenza on the first day of the New South Wales game against the MCC, and Jardine allows Love to substitute for him as the keeper, even though he wasn't even the 12th man, which is a sort of unusual circumstance. And he impresses. He gets a number of stumpings, and at least he's in the New South Wales team, and he's played against an international team, as he played against other English touring teams in the 20s. But then the chance comes for him when, in the infamous incident when Oldfield snicks a short ball from Harold Larwood into his head, and he slightly fractures his skull at Adelaide in the third test, and he's unavailable for the New South Wales game, obviously, that the MCC are playing, and Love fills in there again and does well. And then out of the blue, Love is selected for the fourth test at Brisbane, when he was probably behind Ben Barnett, Charlie Walker as the likely keeper. And he's now 36, making his first his test debut. And unfortunately, it doesn't go all that well for him with the bat. He, despite all those tremendous innings he's had and his very good first-class record, he's dismissed cheaply in both innings. He's involved in a terrible run-out in the second innings, and but his keeping again, right, in a long innings that England had there is full of praise for him. So he's then left out, of course, because Oldfield's okay again for the fifth test, so that's his one and only test.
And let's say a bit about how highly regarded they were, or where they stand in the wicket-keeping pantheon. I'll begin with maybe a few words about Pooley. When
Yes.
he came onto the scene in the early 1860s, he was instantly pronounced by George Parr as the greatest he'd ever seen. Parr had been playing since, I think, the 1840s. Parr also said, incidentally, in a piece of evidence central to my case, that Pooley was the first to dispense with the long stop, that Pooley was the first to dispense with the long stop, and via a series of other bits of evidence, I was able to work out that Pooley's true innovation was to dispense with the long stop only when slow bowlers were on, I should say.
Yes.
Yeah. What makes him inferior to Blackham was that Blackham did it to both fast and slow. He stood up to the stumps with no protection behind him, even to the blistering fast deliveries of Fred Spofforth. So I'd say Pooley's definitely inferior to the likes of Blackham and later George Pinder, but was universally regarded in his time, especially the 1860s, as the best taker of slow bowling there was, and was certainly worthy of being England's first Test wicketkeeper, but got scuppered on that front for reasons that are now notorious. What about Hammy? You said he was unlucky to be a contemporary of Bert Oldfield. Were there any who thought he was unlucky in another sense, perhaps that he might arguably have been Oldfield's superior?
I don't think so, no. I think O'Reilly and Bill Hunt were interviewed about Hammy Love late in their lives, and they always put Oldfield ahead of him as number one, and the selectors did right through the New South Wales days. It was only when Oldfield was unavailable on Test duty or injured, as we saw there, that Love would have taken his place, but he wasn't far behind him at all. And I know you've done the figures there on Pooley, and about 40% of his dismissals were stumpings, which is remarkable, right? Of all those dismissals. I did a similar thing with Hammy Love in a different sort of age, of course, and there were probably more faster bowlers, and he's standing back more than Pooley would have ever. But 28% of his dismissals were stumpings, right, in first-class cricket. And so he was a very fine keeper up to the stumps. He just seemed to have, it wasn't only Oldfield, but he had this very strange decision to go to Victoria. Arthur Maley seems to have encouraged him to go to Victoria, where, as I said, Jack Ellis was entrenched as the keeper there, and he wasn't able to keep very much for Victoria, but he batted and averaged in his 4 or 5 years with Victoria 56 with the bat. So he really shone there. And when he got the chance to keep, again, he was highly praised, and obviously the selectors still regarded him highly enough as in his mid-30s in that Bodyline series to give him his one and only go. Strangely, when he goes to India, even later in his career, with Frank Tarrant's team, the unofficial Australian tour to India, a team led by Jack Ryder and included Charlie McCartney, and this was a pioneering tour by Frank Tarrant, who Mike Howard's written an excellent biography of. And when they went in 1936, Love went, but Jack Ellis was also on the tour also. So he was, again, second stringer behind him and didn't keep as much as Ellis did. Yeah, it's a tour that also Megan Ponsford, Bill Ponsford's daughter, has written beautifully about in the last couple of years. I'd recommend that to anyone watching. So, yeah, to get back to your question, he's hamstrung in his, if you pardon the pun, in his career, because he's behind a couple of very good keepers, as luck would have it.
As luck would have it. I mean, we talk about him having at least two superiors as a wicketkeeper in his era, but he does sound like he was unmatched as a wicketkeeper batsman. If he'd been playing in this day and age, when the focus was almost more on the batting than it is on the wicketkeeping, it seems inarguable that he might have been selected ahead of Oldfield, the likes of Oldfield.
That's right. Yeah, I think the selectors in those days, as people would still argue today, picked the best wicketkeeper, number one, and Oldfield, certainly his batting wasn't as strong as Hammy's, but his superiority in the keeping made him a no-brainer for the selectors right through the 20s, and the praise that he gets from all players at that time, including Bradman. I think it's clear that he was a very, very fine keeper, and as good as Hammy was, and as good as batsman as Hammy was, I don't think Hammy would have ever felt that he was hard done by. It was just wrong man at the wrong time in some ways.
Now, I wanted to say a bit about our two subjects as men, as human beings, as flesh and blood. On the face of it, rather different.
Yes.
Pooley was the archetypal London Cockney, the cheeky chappy, dubious morals. He had abandoned his wife and children, had what seems like a betting addiction and a drinking addiction, and not a very faithful husband. Whereas Hammy seems to have been pretty straight-laced and archetypally gentlemanly.
Yes, as I said, he went to a private school, St Andrew's College, right in the heart of Sydney. He was in business down in Victoria when he first went down there with a highly regarded businessman, and then he ended up an accountant. And someone more different from Pooley, I don't think we could get in Hammy Love, because he ended up living and playing in a very affluent part of Sydney, Mossman, and that's where he ended his career, and very successfully. He was in Mossman's team of the century, as I point out, with a number of very fine test players that Mossman have produced over the last 100 years. And he died at Mossman. So yes, he was a very straight-laced, upper middle class, but a very genuine sort of fella too, who people really enjoyed, as I said, playing with, and but just a very different class from Pooley. Pooley ended up where did he end up, Rodney? In a poorhouse, basically.
Did in the Lambeth workhouse he did.
Yes.
Although I mean their backgrounds weren't similar. In a note you sent me, you had a bullet point titled "Class," saying Love was upper middle compared to Pooley. Pooley was actually from at least a middle class background. He was one of only two members of Lillywhite's pioneering 1876-77 team, for example, who had a middle name. His full name, of course, is Edward William. That's usually a marker of these things in the English class system. His father was a schoolmaster. He was educated at home. He seems, from surviving scraps of his writing, to have been a fairly literate character. In fact, in one rather aggressive letter he wrote to the editor of a newspaper with whose coverage he took issue, he made a few Shakespearean allusions, which to contemporary commentators and other letter writers, in fact, cast doubt over his authorship. He was assumed to have been a working class boy, and the fact that he would casually drop Shakespearean allusions and references got several observers thinking he must have had the help of some higher up at Surrey to put this together. But it doesn't seem to have been the case. On the other hand, he seems to have been far more comfortable with being a professional cricketer in the sense by which we understand that designation in the 19th century. He never wrote out his full name. He was always happy to dispense with the middle one. Despite being in his winter employment, a clerk in the City of London, he always gave his profession in the censuses as cricketer. So he's largely deceived us all. Not quite the stereotype he's been made out to be.
No.
Would you say there are any parallel misconceptions about Hammy?
I suppose not so much as Pooley, and I know this is something that's really at the heart of your article, that he's been damned as a delinquent, basically, as you call him there, and a troublemaker, and he's in prison, and he's a match fixer, and
not entirely all of this, unjustifiable, but a bit too much has been made of some of those charges.
And so no, Love is. I meant to say that he's called Hampton after the Governor General, the New South Wales Governor at the time. So that gives you an indication of his parents and their, who they see as their heroes or mentors, I suppose, in their life. So he's the only thing I'd say about Love is I think his batting has been underrated. He's been seen as a keeper batsman because that's how he played his only test. And he failed as a batsman, as I said, unfortunately, in that only test. But if you look into his career, his early New South Wales career and his Victorian career, he's got a very fine record. And I think that's been neglected because he's just been, and he really should be seen as a batsman keeper because he made his way in most games as a batsman. where, as I said, Oldfield or Ellis or someone else was actually donning the gloves during those games. And even though he made 5 and 3 in his only test, he's actually, I think, an underrated batsman, and that's why I've sort of, in the statistician sort of style, sort of put in his partnerships and the figures there of the very fine partnerships and his own individual record as a batsman. So I think he's been underrated there and just been seen as a keeper who didn't quite make it.
Right. Well, I think we've covered virtually everything we'd meant to. Perhaps you'd like to tease whatever it is you're working on presently. You mentioned pre-Golden Age bowling. Perhaps we could have a sneak preview of what you're looking into there.
I suppose I've written a few things that have been published. Jack Cuff, who's a New South Wales all-rounder, mainly a bowler, and then he ended up playing 10 years at Worcester. So that book came out a couple of years ago, The Perplexing and Tragic Life of Jack Cuff. I looked at 2 working-class cricketers from the early 1900s, Alex Commode, who also went over and played for Lancashire, having had a very minimal New South Wales career, very successful Lancashire career, and then Arthur McBeath, who's the latest book I've had published up by Red Rose Books in England. Not a Lancashire player at all, never went overseas, but very much underrated early 20th century bowler for New South Wales, who had a fine record, probably a bit unlucky not to play for Australia. And recently I've looked at a couple of leg spinners from the early days. Michael Pearce, who has been very neglected, played in the very first ever Shield game, took 13 wickets in it, 8 for and 5 for, and had a successful first season and then seems to have disappeared without trace. So we've been tracking his life and career, and most recently Sid Emery from the 1912 tour, who had a very fine career, brief as it was, and played in the Triangular tournament, played 4 tests. Didn't have much success there, although he bowled Hobbs a couple of times on that tour. Got CB Fry out, got Warner out, so he could definitely bowl. He was known as Mad Mick, so an interesting character. So those characters from 100 years or so ago, the ones that I'm attracted to, they just seem to be multi-dimensional, have many layers to them, and it was a very different age, but they're intriguing characters, and it takes a bit of digging, but that's part of the thrill of the chase, I suppose. What about you, Rodney? What are you
I think I mentioned what I've got in the pipeline earlier.
Yes.
What's turning out to be almost Russian novel in length now. My treatment of Test Match #1. There turns out to be so much stuff and nonsense and Piers Morgan written about that subject. So merely correcting the record is proving a Herculean task. To this day, for example, we read on websites like Cricket Archive and Cricinfo that it was slated to be a timeless match. It wasn't. It was a 4-day affair. No. The Englishman had an engagement in Bendigo the very next day.
Yes.
Other myths like that Pooley was actually in jail at the time the match was being played. No, he managed to find a few sympathetic friends in Christchurch. He stumped up the £100 or so to get him out on bail and become an honorary member of various cricket clubs out there, while he should by rights have been keeping wicket for England. Other findings, like the truth of the life of Jack Hodges, who bowled Australia's very first Test delivery. I won't say too much about that now, but I will say that it's quite something. So yeah, there's a lot of ground to cover there. I think in future I'll be sticking to, I don't know, biographical treatments. When you do one match, you're almost doing 22 different biographies, aren't you?
Yes.
So yeah, I've made a rod for my back there, but I'm proceeding apace.
Very good. We look forward to seeing that come out.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we'll leave it there. I quite like this format, don't you? I think it shows some
Very good.
promise.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we're able to get two other journal contributors next month, or next quarter, I should say. It's a quarterly journal to exchange notes in this way, maybe in front of an audience who perhaps can ask questions while it's proceeding. I think it went pretty well. At least on your side, it did. Like I say, after South Africa's heroics in the Rugby World Cup final last night, I'm a bit addled in the brain and more than a little hungover, I'm afraid. So,
well, we're just suffering a general hangover of Australian rugby every day, so including the loss of the coach today. So I'd rather be in your shoes.
Do Australians care much for union?
In two states we do, New South Wales and Queensland. The rest of Australia doesn't much.
I spent a good deal of time in Victoria earlier this year and had maybe a sentence-long conversation about rugby union. You know, it doesn't seem
lucky to get that much.
Yeah, I mean, league is bigger there, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. They've got the Melbourne team in the National Rugby League, or they've got a team in the Super Rugby too, the Melbourne Rebels. But yeah, rugby's in a bad way in Australia. It needs a complete revamp. So.
And are you knocked out of the Cricket World Cup yet?
Definitely not.
No, you're still there and thereabouts. I haven't been following it all that closely, to be honest.
Oh, we've won 4 in a row there, so we're right back into it.
These group stages seem way too generous for me. They're interminable,
they're long,
and it seems very difficult to get knocked out, doesn't it?
Yeah, I can't see us winning it, but we're playing a lot better than we were at the start. There was an amazing game last night. Australia made 388. And New Zealand were 9 for 383.
I caught the last few overs of that. That was quite fun. Yeah. What's the game coming to though? When 388 is barely a defensible target.
No, they were getting criticised for going too slowly at one stage. So